Hello, everyone. Looks like we have folks still trickling in, so we'll give folks a couple more minutes, and then we'll get the webinar started. Well, hello, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really excited to walk through the session here with everybody. My name is Victor Hart. I'm an account executive here with Demand Driven Technologies, and I'll be walking everybody through the presentation today. Just a couple quick housekeeping items. Everybody is on listen only mode, but we do have the chat box open. So if you do have questions, feel free to put those into the chat box. We'll be responding to those as you put them in, and we'll also have a Q&A session here at the end of the call so we can have a bit more broader discussion around the questions that come up. And then this presentation is being recorded, so everybody that was registered for the webinar today will be receiving a link shortly after the webinar concludes. With the housekeeping out of the way, then let's get into the content here. So the agenda for the meeting this morning, I've got a brief introduction into our company, and then want to spend the bulk of the time talking about the limitations of the traditional MRP and how companies around the world are simplifying their material management by the adoption of the demand-driven MRP. Talk about some of the success stories that we've achieved with clients in various different industries. And then I'd like to give everyone just a high-level overview of Replenishment Plus, which is our demand-driven MRP software. So with that, let's get into it. And I'd like to start by talking about the concept of autopilot. You know, almost every commercial flight on the world, regardless of where they're flying to, relies very heavily on autopilot, where once the plane is in the air, the pilots are largely sitting back and letting autopilot run the plane, take it across its route. And the pilots are just there to deal with any issues that get detected by the autopilot that they might need to address. So, you know, every single passenger on these planes is 30,000 feet in the air in a metal tube with the knowledge and the trust that they're going to get where they're going safely based on these autopilot systems. Now, if we can do that in the commercial air industry, then why can't we take the same approach to managing supply chains? Why can't supply chain leaders use a best of breed planning tool to largely manage their supply chains on autopilot, so to speak, while simply alerting to them when any adjustments need to be made. What I'm going to try to do here today is show you that via the demand-driven MRP methodology, we can achieve those same kind of results. So we are demand-driven technologies, and we empower supply chain leaders to achieve tangible, sustainable results via advanced demand-driven supply chain planning solutions. And we'll talk in much more detail about what that means. Demand-driven technologies, we were founded in 2011. And we're very much the global leader across the demand-driven enterprise. We were the first to bring a demand-driven MRP tool to the market and are a global affiliate of the Demand-Driven Institute with an entire suite of supply chain products fully compliant across the Demand-Driven Institute certifications. We're venture-backed, based in Atlanta, Georgia. We have another office in the Seattle area, as well as within the past year, we opened up a European office located in Bordeaux, France region to help us better serve our European clients. And we've successfully implemented these DDMRP solutions across over 100 different clients on every single continent, making us very much the global leader in the demand-driven movement. Here are just a few of those clients in various different industries. Two main takeaways that I'd like for folks to have on this slide. This demand-driven approach has been proven to be very, very successful amongst many different verticals within the manufacturing and distribution space. And then the methodology and in turn the software itself is highly scalable depending on the size of the business. So for example, we have clients that are very small, single location distributors, and we have clients that are very, very large as well, with hundreds of production facilities across the globe and really everywhere in between. So no matter what size your organization is, you can be confident that the demand-driven approach will be able to generate a lot of value for you. And our singular goal as a company is to deliver tangible and sustainable results to our clients. So our highest priority via the demand-driven approach is to maintain or improve on service levels. So our clients typically see on-time fill rate performance in the 97 to 99% range. Many of our clients are also able to compress their cumulative lead times. We've seen lead time compression as much as 80%. And then they've been able to do this while simultaneously reducing their overall inventory levels, typically in the 25 to 45% range. So very tangible results that can make a huge impact on the business. And our singular goal as a company is to help our clients achieve those goals. So the topic of the discussion today are the limitations of current MRP systems and how DDMRP helps us to overcome those limitations. And so let's start by talking about MRP and the limitations therein. MRP is the primary planning logic that's used in all of the major ERP systems. And it was introduced in the 70s, but really hasn't changed since then. You know, the world around it has changed quite dramatically, but the planning logic that most companies out there are using has not evolved with that. At a very high level, MRP is reliant on sales forecasts to drive all of the planning practices. Essentially, planners will take some sort of sales projection or some sort of forecast, plug that into their MRP engine. That's then going to blow that forecasted demand down through any bills of material. And that forecasted demand then is what we use to create all of our resupply orders, expecting that we will need certain materials at certain times based on that demand. forecasted demand, but there's a really, really dramatic flaw that's inherent in that system. And that flaw is the assumption that forecast is going to be accurate. Forecasts, by definition, are inaccurate, and the more precise we try to be with those forecasts, the more profound that inaccuracy becomes. And so relying on those inaccurate forecasts over time is going to result in materials being misaligned with what the actual market demand is. So that means at any given point in time, there are going to be some materials that we forecasted we're going to sell a lot of, but those sales don't come to fruition. Therefore, we have a lot of operating capital tied up in inventory that's not moving, while at the same time, there are other materials where we didn't expect to sell too many of, sales really picked up, and we get put in a really stressed inventory position. Maybe we can't fulfill those sales, and so we miss out on them, or we have to resort to expensive expedites or something of the like. And so this is what we call a bimodal inventory distribution, which simply means at any given point in time, we have too much of the wrong materials on hand and too little of the right. This often results in planners developing a certain level of mistrust with their MRP systems. They don't trust the signals that they're getting from those systems. And so in an attempt to plan more accurately, they'll take data outside of the systems, put those into some kind of Excel spreadsheet. And that obviously is going to entail a lot of manual effort and also make them very susceptible to user errors within those spreadsheets. Now, in the past, we've found that about 95% of companies out there are using spreadsheets in some way, shape, or form to plan their materials. But I thought it'd be interesting to update those statistics. And so I'm going to send a poll out to everybody. And the question is quite simple. Is your company using spreadsheets to plan materials? Would really appreciate some feedback from you folks. So I'll give everybody a few moments here to respond to that, and we'll see how the numbers come up. All right, just a few more moments to get those votes in. And that should be good enough. So we're seeing very much in line with that. The vast majority of the folks on the call here today are utilizing spreadsheets to manage their materials. And what I hope you'll come away with the presentation today is that there's a better way to do that. All right, thanks for everyone for voting in that poll. So in order to overcome those challenges, demand-driven MRP was developed. It was developed over several different industries, but it was or decades, but it was really brought to market in 2011, and it borrows some of the principles from MRP, but it combines those with principles from some other supply chain methodologies such as lean and theory of constraints. It's really a fusion of all of these different pillars of supply chain management that come together to form what we think is a best of breed solution. It enables strategic inventory positioning, thus pacing inventory to what actual market demand is, resulting in an ultimately smoother materials flow. The big way that it's different is that DDMRP breaks away from that reliance on forecast-driven planning and shifts to a more consumption-driven planning practice. Whereas MRP utilizes those forecasts to create supply orders in anticipation of when they think they're going to be needed. Demand-driven MRP is only going to use actual demand within a relevant range to impact the planning equation. Using that true consumption, is going to give us a near perfect demand signal in terms of what will be sold and when it will be sold. So in order to do that, we're going to leverage what are called DDMRP buffers. These buffers are applied at the item level, item location level, and they're designed to ensure constant material availability. There are 3 zones within a buffer. The green zone is sized to support our average order size or our desired order frequency. Frequently, we'll use a minimum order quantity or a minimum batch size to size the green zone. But if there's a desired ordering cadence, such as a lot of our clients will want to create new purchase orders once a week, we can size the green zone accordingly. Essentially, the green zone is going to set that ordering cadence and set the average ordering size. The next zone is the yellow zone, and this is sized to cover usage over 1 lead time. So over a given lead time, on average, how much of an item are we going to be consuming? And that's going to fluctuate over time as our consumption fluctuates. And so the yellow zone is going to utilize a concept called the average daily usage, which is simply a rolling historical average of our consumption. As that average increases, the yellow zone will increase in response to that, and vice versa. And then the last zone here is the red zone. This is sized to address item variation. It protects me against variation within an item. That can mean variation on the supply side. That could mean variation on the demand side as well, seasonality, things of that nature. The more variation there is with an item, the thicker my red zone needs to protect me against that. And then these buffer zones are each going to be recalculating their size on a daily basis in response to the fluctuations in demand that we experience. And then we're going to know when to place a new resupply order and for how much based on what's called our net flow equation. The net flow is really quite simple. It's calculated as my current on-hand inventory plus any open supply that we have. We'll subtract from that then any qualified demand. And demand is going to qualify if it's due to be fulfilled today or in the past, or if it's what's called a qualified spike. And a qualified spike is firm demand that's due in the near future, that's a large enough quantity that I want to go ahead and factor it into the equation today. So the net flow is essentially just a summary of everything that's flowing in and out of my supply chain for that item, and it's going to work in conjunction with the buffers to tell me when I need to place new resupply orders and how much. So on a daily basis, our buffer zones are going to be building themselves. We've got the green zone, which is going to set our ordering size. We've got the yellow zone, which is going to give us coverage over 1 lead time. And then the red zone, which is going to protect against variation. And you can think of each one of these columns as a different day. And so as our demand fluctuates, the buffer zones are going to be resizing themselves on a daily basis. And we'll know when to order and how much based on where the net flow is within the buffer. The net flow will start out at the top of the green zone. Over time, as we consume materials, that net flow is going to decrease with respect to the buffer. And when it crosses out of the green zone into either the yellow or the red zone, that's going to trigger an order recommendation, with the quantity being enough to get the net flow back up to the top of the green zone. And then our on-hand inventory will be a little bit lower in the buffer than that. And we can see 1 lead time after accepting any recommended orders, our on-hand inventory will subsequently increase, indicating that we've received that order. The goal primarily is going to be keeping this net flow position in the green zone, which is going to help us keep an inventory level that is paced to what the actual market demand is. As we deploy DDMRP, these are the various steps that are involved. And the first one here, positionings, says strategic decoupling. Anytime you want to deploy DDMRP, the first thing that you have to do is determine where does it make sense to apply these buffers, because not necessarily is every single item going to be appropriate for one of these dynamic buffers. We typically see 50, 60, 70% of items are buffered, sometimes more, sometimes less. It just depends on the unique environment of the client. But there's certainly going to be certain items where they might be make to order or buy to order items. And then some low runner items you might want to keep some stock of, but you don't necessarily need that to be dynamic. And so we can use min-max levels that are more appropriate for those. The decoupling, anytime we place a buffer at an item, we can expect constant availability based on that item's consumption. And that's then going to essentially decouple anything downstream from the variability upstream from that item. That's going to help us compress those lead times. That's going to help us dampen variability along the supply chain and significantly reduce the potential impact of the bullwhip effect. So going through, spending the time to determine where does it make sense to apply these buffers is really critical. Once you make those determinations, next you then need to determine which buffer profiles are appropriate for which items. There can be dozens and dozens of different buffer profiles that are going to cause the buffers to behave slightly differently depending on things like how variable the item is, how long the lead time is, so on and so forth. Once those are applied though, the buffers are then going to be dynamically adjusting on a daily basis or even multiple times throughout the day in response to the fluctuations in demand. Based on that net flow position, the system will be recommending orders for purchase parts, make parts, transferred parts, and the like to help maintain healthy inventory position. And it's very easy from the software standpoint to execute upon those recommendations to generate the corresponding orders within any ERP system. So as I mentioned, we have a full suite of Demand-Driven Institute compliant products, from materials planning, sales and operations planning, as well as scheduling and execution on the production floor. But what I'm going to focus on today when we get into the actual software is our materials planning tool called Replenishment Plus. And again, this was the first and remains the most widely adopted DDMRP tool around the world. Replenishment Plus is a cloud-based solution. It's hosted in the Microsoft Azure environment, which has been a very good home to us over the years. Microsoft provides the reliability, scalability, and perhaps most importantly, the security to enable us to support clients of various sizes all across the world. It's translated into 15 different languages, and we're very proud of that fact. So wherever in the world you do business, it's highly likely that Replenishment Plus is available in your language. And it's very easy to deploy and to integrate with the client's ERP system. Here are just a few of the major ERP systems that we've had successful integrations with. And the whole idea here is that the ERP system is going to maintain or remain the system of record. All of the inventory data, all of the transactional data will still live within the ERP system. And that ERP will simply communicate with Replenishment Plus on a scheduled basis to share that inventory and transactional data such that Replenishment Plus can run the DDMRP logic and then write any recommendations back into the ERP system to create all of the corresponding work orders, purchase orders, and the like to be worked within the ERP as it is today. So as I mentioned, our singular focus as a company is to deliver tangible and sustainable results to our clients. I hope in the presentation today, you'll see how the software solutions are able to deliver on that. And I wanted to highlight just a couple of client achievements that we've achieved. Again, the goal is to maintain very, very high service levels around the 99% range, but that most often comes along with decreases in overall inventory levels and compression of cumulative lead times. And so just a couple examples here of those types of results that we've achieved with clients in various different industries. We've got tons of other case studies as well. And so if you're curious about the type of results we've achieved in your industry, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'd be glad to share some additional information with you. And with that now, I would like to jump over into the software and give you a high-level overview of Replenishment Plus and how it delivers on these core concepts of the demand-driven MRP methodology. So as I mentioned, Replenishment Plus is a cloud-based solution. You can access the platform via any modern web browser. And I'm logged into the home screen here. So anytime a planner logs in, this is going to be the first screen that they see. On the right, I can see when the last time my system synced with my ERP system. Some of our clients have that set to sync on a nightly basis. Other clients in a higher velocity environment require that to sync several times throughout the day. And so depending on your business requirements, we can set that up accordingly. And then when a planner logs in, the two windows over here are going to be their primary concerns to start with on a day-to-day basis. We've got planning priorities and the execution alerts. I'll start with my planning priorities. This is going to show me essentially what all needs my attention today. It's a list of all of my items sorted by priority. That priority is based on where the net flow is within the buffer for that item today. And so I have 3 items here that the net flow is critically low in the red zone. So I'm definitely going to be creating new resupply orders for those items today. I might also need to do some additional digging to determine what's happened, why has my net flow gotten so low within the red zone. I've got 3 items here where the net flow is just crossed into the red zone, so I'm going to be placing orders for those today. I don't have any non-buffered items here. The NB over here stands for non-buffered, meaning any items that showed up there would be either make to order or buy to order parts, but we'll still manage those within Replenishment Plus, even though they're not buffered, so that we can take advantage of the ordering automation. And anytime we have demand come in against a non-buffered part, Replenishment Plus will show it in the red, so we're sure to accept the recommended orders to fulfill said demand. I've got 6 items here where my net flow is in the yellow zone, so I've got orders recommended against those today, but I don't need to really do any additional digging into those items. I can simply trust the logic that's running in the background, accept the recommended orders, and move on with my day, much like the autopilot concept we talked about earlier. I've got 3 or 8 items rather where net flow is in the green zone, so I'm in a good inventory position for those items. I don't need to take any action against them. And then I have 3 items down here that are in blue. That means that the net flow is actually over the top of the green zone, indicating that I've got too much supply planned for those items, and I can look for opportunities to reduce said supply. Maybe one of those items has a work order scheduled for next week that I don't really need to do anymore. So I can cancel that work order and allocate that capacity to another higher priority item, something along those lines. So Replenishment Plus will give me visibility into where I'm oversupplied so I can look for opportunities to reduce that. Now, I could click into any one of these individual tiles to pull up those specific items, or I can come over into my workbench to view all of those items. And again, I've got them listed out here based on priority, critical, high, medium, so on and so forth. There's a lot of data that's available here within the planner's workbench. Some of this data comes over directly from the ERP system. Some of it's calculated by Replenishment Plus. Each user can customize how they want that data displayed here and in what order. It's very easy to drag and drop these columns around. I can select which columns I want to include in my workbench and which I want to exclude. I can set up filters, so on and so forth. The way that I have my workbench configured though is to show my priority first over here on the left, and then on the right I can see the raw math that goes into that net flow equation. So my net flow is currently just at 13% of the buffer, which is critically low in the red zone. That net flow again is calculated by my current on-hand inventory plus any open supply that I have, and then minus any qualified demand. So that gives me my net flow position of 14 today. Because that's in the red zone, I'm going to order to get that up to the top of the green zone, which is currently at 110. So that gives me a recommended order quantity of 96 units today. I can see a visual representation of that if I come into the buffer sizing tab. So here I can see how my green, yellow, and red zones are sized today. And then I can see that my net flow represented by this purple line here is way down into the red zone. So visually, I can see instantly that I'm going to be placing an order today to get this net flow back up to the top of the green zone. I can also see what my current on-hand inventory is, and I can compare that against my expected average inventory. Now, we're not planning specifically to that expected average inventory, but it's good visibility for me to see what that is for benchmarking and comparison sakes. And that's based on the average daily usage of this item today. Again, that's a rolling historical average. The time horizon depends entirely on the client in terms of how we calculate that. Frequently, it's around a 90-day rolling average. Sometimes it needs to be longer, sometimes it needs to be shorter, but again, that is determined by the client's environment. But the average daily usage of 6 units today is going to give me an average inventory of 7 days coverage for this item. If I want to get a bit more granular, I can see the raw math of the net flow. If I want to know what transactions are going into calculating that net flow, I can come into the all activity tab here, and this is going to show me every single open transaction that this item currently resides on. Anything in red or blue is being factored into that net flow equation today. Red represents demand, blue represents supply. So we can see that this item is featured on some bills of material. So we've got some work order demand against it, but also we sell this item on its own. So we've got some sales order demand against that as well. These items or these transactions here, it looks like those are a few days late. So again, in our net flow, we're factoring in demand that's due to be fulfilled either today or in the past. So we've got some past due demand here, as well as another work order that's due today. And then I've got a couple of those spikes on here, which is demand that's due to be fulfilled in the future, but it's a near enough future and the quantity is large enough that I want to go ahead and factor that into my net flow today. The threshold for that, typically, it can vary depending on the client, but typically we'll set that threshold such that if the demand is due within 1 lead time and the quantity is greater than or equal to half of the red zone, then we'll factor it in as a spike. So if I come back to my buffer sizing here, I can see that my red zone today is sized at 30 units. So this work order, it's due within 1 lead time. I have a 10-day lead time on this item. So it's due within 1 lead time. The quantity is greater than half of the red zone, so I'm factoring that in as a spike today. The last transaction down here, the quantity is greater than half of the red zone, but it's not due within that lead time horizon yet, so I don't need to worry about that transaction yet. I can leave it out there, not factor it in as a spike yet, and wait until the last minute, so to speak, to factor that in, because something might change between now and then. My demand might pick up, thus my red zone might increase to a point where that work order no longer meets that 50% threshold of the red zone. So the whole idea is, since things might change, I want to wait until I absolutely have to deal with those transactions. The other piece of the all activity tab here that a planner would want to keep an eye on is my running balance column. What this is showing me is what my inventory position is going to be as these transactions come to fruition. And what I want to keep an eye out for is anytime my running balance column goes to a negative quantity, that's going to indicate a stock out to me. So I can see that I've got a stock out here today. I'll be further stocked out in a few days in the future unless I get some additional supply in. So I've got visibility into when those stockouts might be occurring such that I can take the appropriate action now to prevent that from happening. I can, of course, filter to show only my supply orders or only my demand allocations if I so choose. And then the analytics tab here, this is going to show us a historical view of the buffer. So I've got it set on the last 6 months. You can customize that date range if you want to. I feel like 6 months is a pretty good representation though. And so what we're looking at is over the past 6 months on a daily basis, how has the buffer sized itself? We can see that in our peak consumption here, the top of the buffer was near 200. That drops down to a little over 120. And that's all being driven by the actual consumption for this item. You can see that it's about a 40% drop in demand, which the buffer accounts for really quite well. I can add my net flow line on here, and this is a really good illustration of how this net flow logic works. Whenever that net flow drops down into the yellow zone, the planner has been doing a good job of accepting the orders that are recommended to get that net flow back up to the top of the green zone. And then I can add my actual on-hand inventory, and we can see that it follows that pattern to some degree. One lead time after the order is recommended, the on-hand inventory jumps up indicating that we've received that order. Now, you'll notice that as consumption drops off, our buffer starts to shrink and my on-hand inventory gets a little bit high with respect to the buffer. That's perfectly okay. That's what the buffers are designed for. We simply go a little bit longer without creating a new resupply order to get our on-hand inventory back down to where we want it. And over time, what I want to see from a well-performing buffer is exactly what we see here. This on-hand inventory is fluctuating around the low to mid part of the yellow zone. Occasionally, it's going to jump up towards the green zone. Occasionally, it's going to drop down and consume some of the red zone. But over time, on average, it's going to fluctuate around the low to mid part of the yellow zone. Now, this view is going to give a planner really clear visibility into how well they've been managing this item. So for example, if the on-hand inventory was constantly near the top of the yellow zone, that would tell me as a planner that I'm carrying too much inventory for this item. I can thin out my buffers to get my inventory a little bit leaner without really being at risk of a stock out. Or conversely, if that on-hand inventory was constantly near the bottom of the red zone, well, then I'm being too risky. Any kind of spike will probably cause me to stock out, so I need to thicken up my buffers to give myself a little bit extra protection so I can keep my strong service level goals. All right, so all of that is going on in the background on a day-to-day basis. Being calculated based on the transactional and inventory data that the ERP system is sharing. And it's not necessarily a level of detail that a planner would want to go into for every single item. In fact, that would probably be impossible, especially if you're managing hundreds or thousands of items. You can't go into this level of detail for every single item. And so that's where these priorities come into play. I can focus on the critical priority items to determine what's gone wrong, what's happened to get me so low within the red zone. But the rest of the items, we want to take that autopilot approach. Trust the logic, trust the recommendations that are being generated, and simply accept those to keep us in a good inventory position. So in order to accept the recommendations, it's a very simple process here. I can either check mark these items one by one And at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice that it's keeping track of how many recommendations are marked for approval. So I could do that one by one, or I could simply mark all. When I click approve orders, that will then generate a bunch of pending orders in this pending order table, where the items are going to be sitting, simply waiting for the ERP system to come retrieve them and generate the corresponding purchase orders, work orders, or transfer orders to go through whatever kind of approvals process you already have established around those orders. You might notice that we generated multiple orders for some of these items. For example, FPA, we have 2 different work orders here. Reason for that has to do with some sort of order parameter that we have established. We'll always respect any order minimums, order maximums, or order multiples. And so in this example, that's likely why we see 2 different orders being generated for FPA. We probably exceeded that order maximum, and so had to create a separate work order for the remainder. Now I'm going to delete a few of these orders because I want to illustrate to you the power of decoupling, strategically placing these buffers along the bill of material to ensure optimum inventory levels, compress lead times, so on and so forth. And so I'm going to take a look now at a make part and look at the bill of material for that part. So FPA is a manufactured part for us. I'm going to expand this here and take a look at the bill of material. This bill of material is brought over directly from the ERP system so that we're working with the same information in Replenishment Plus as we are in the ERP. So FPA is my finished good, and then we can see we've got several layers of BOM here for FPA. Some of these are purchase parts like PPA, some are sub-assemblies like SAE. Any item that has this red, yellow, green icon is going to be a buffered item, so we can expect constant material availability for that item. Any item with this gray icon is a non-buffered part, and then the non-buffered part with a black circle around it indicates my longest non-buffered leg, the longest lead time of my make to order or buy to order parts. And so we can use this to see what impact could buffering some of these items have on my inventory levels as well as lead time for FPA. FPA has a manufacturing lead time of 10 days. So once we have all the materials available to us, it takes 10 days to make FPA, but we've got a cumulative R+ lead time, known as the decoupled lead time, of 35 days. Reason for that is we've got this buy to order part, PPA, which has a 25-day lead time. So anytime we want to make FPA, we first have to order PPA, wait 25 days for it to get to us, still have the 10-day manufacturing time for FPA, so that gives me my cumulative lead time of 35 days. With that in mind, we can see that my buffer here, the top of the buffer is just over 300. My net flow is currently in the middle of the yellow zone, so Replenishment Plus, based on the net flow logic, is recommending that I make about 100 additional units of FPA, and I can expect my average inventory for FPA to be around 85 units. So what would happen then if we made the strategic decision, the financial commitment to start stocking PPA? What would that do in terms of my finished good here? So I'm gonna go into my part editor and assign a buffer to PPA, and we can see what's gonna happen. So I've already got it filtered here. I'm gonna pull up my details. I'm moving rather quickly here. And for time's sake, I'm just gonna add the first buffer that I see to it. Instantly, we can see how the buffer for PPA would be sized. Obviously, we've got no on hand right now, and so we'll have an initial supply order, but then moving forward, I could expect this buffer to ensure constant material availability for PPA. So now that I've saved that, I can come back into my workbench, and the system's updating in the background. And what we'll see in a moment is that I need to refresh it because updating PPA has now caused other things in the system to change. And so I'm going to update my view here, and we can see that now where FPA was in the yellow zone, it's no longer there. And in fact, if I come over here, we can see that FPA is now in a blue priority, indicating that net flow is over the top of the green zone. So what happened? Well, if I come back to my bill of material here, I can see that now that we're buffering PPA, the longest non-buffered leg of this bill of material is the subassembly SAE. So now whenever I want to create or make FPA, first I have to order SAE, only wait 4 days for that to become available to me. And we still have that 10-day manufacturing lead time, but that means that my cumulative lead time has dropped from 35 days all the way to 14 days. So a dramatic compression of the lead time there, and that's going to have a big impact on the inventory position that we need to maintain. If I come back into the buffer, we can see that it's changed quite dramatically. Previously, the net flow was in the yellow zone, so I would have been making additional units. Now my net flow is so far over the top of the green that it's not even showing up in my chart here. So rather than making additional units, I can now look for opportunities to reduce my supply for FPA. And then we can see that my expected average inventory, because my lead time is so much shorter, has shrunk from an average of 85 all the way down to an average of 41. And so two things that we've accomplished here. Number one, we've made ourselves more responsive to our customers by dramatically compressing the cumulative lead time for our finished good. And we've also dramatically decreased the amount of inventory we need to keep on average for that finished good to satisfy the market demand. So that is a really good illustration of the power of that decoupling effect and why it's so critical to go through the entire BOM structure and strategically place these buffers in places that make the most sense. Now, if I go back to my home screen, most of what we talked about so far is in the planning priorities. Where are my net flow positions with respect to the buffer? And based on that, what do I need to order today and what quantities, so on and so forth. My first goal is to get all of those items that are in red and yellow down here into the green zone, thus ensuring I'm pacing my inventory to what our actual market demand is. Once I've achieved that, then I want to turn my attention to my execution alerts. And what these are going to show me is not so much to do with net flow and the buffers as they are to do with potential issues, specifically potential stockouts that might be occurring with the timing of supply and demand. So there are 3 different types of execution alerts, sorted or ordered by priority. My first one here are my current inventory alerts. These are showing me items that I am currently stocked out on today. Stockouts are going to happen occasionally. We try to avoid them if we can, but there are going to be scenarios where they happen and it's just unavoidable. So when that does occur, we certainly want to be alerted of that so we can open up those items and look look for what kind of impact that might have down the line. Put in notes about when the supplier has guaranteed, for example, that we'll get the item, so on and so forth. So current inventory alerts show us where we are currently stocked out, which is our first priority. Next, we see our material synchronization alerts. These show me items where, well, I'm not stocked out today. Based on the timing of supply and demand, I will definitively stock out at some point in the future unless I take some kind of action. So I can open these up to give you a good illustration of that. And so we can see I'm not stocked out today on this item, but based on when this supply is going to be available to me and when this demand is going to be due, I will stock out unless I take some kind of action. So I might look to expedite this purchase order. I might look to place a separate purchase order from a supplier with a shorter lead time, something along those lines. So I'll be alerted to where those stockouts are going to be occurring unless I do something about it. And of course, if I fail to take any action, eventually that stock out is going to come to fruition, at which point this no longer is a material synchronization alert. It moves up the priority list and becomes a current inventory alert because that stock out event occurred. And then the third type of alert here is our projected stock out. And these are items that, while I don't have any demand in the system today that's going to cause a stock out in the future, if my current average daily usage continues at its current pace, I will most likely stock out unless I take some kind of action. So not necessarily do I need to take action against these items, but I should look into them a bit more detail to make sure that I'm keeping everything in a good position here to prevent potential stockouts from occurring in the future. Very common when we initially implement with a client because of that bimodal inventory distribution that I talked about earlier in the call. There'll be many alerts listed here, but as the client progresses in time, as they mature in their use and the trust of the system, we see those alerts really dwindling away until they're really few and far between. So those are the two sections of the system that are going to be a planner's primary concern on a day-to-day basis. There's lots of additional details that we just don't have time to get into today in terms of additional seasonality settings. How do we proactively manipulate these buffers based around known events that occur in the business? If you would like to explore those concepts in more detail, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would love to walk you through those. But the last thing that I wanted to show here in the demonstration before we get to the Q&A session is from a reporting standpoint. There are lots of reporting functionality built into the system, from predefined reports to custom built reports, the ability for users to create their own reports. But the one I wanted to talk about today is called our buffer trend report. And this is what's going to help us monitor the overall health of the environment and ultimately determine how successful an implementation has been. And so this is at an aggregate view. You can filter around planners, locations, part types, part groups, so on and so forth. But right now we're looking at the organization as a whole. And this is a 2-axis graph here. So on the left-hand side, this is going to show us my distribution of parts based on where the net flow is within the buffer. So we can see at the start of this time period, about 20% of the parts had net flows in the red zone, about 10 to 12% were over the top of green. But then over time, we've largely eliminated those overstock positions. Still have a few that are in the red zone. That's perfectly okay. But what we want to see is, by and large, most of our parts are in the green zone or some in the yellow zone. And so over here at the far right of this time period, we can see that about 90% of the parts are in the green zone, which is indicative of a really healthy environment. And then on the right-hand side, we see our overall inventory levels. The black line represents our target inventory. The purple line represents our actual on hand. And so again, we see a really healthy environment here where my on-hand inventory is fluctuating around our targets, meaning we're keeping our inventory where we want it. We're pacing that inventory to what the actual market demand is, so that we can maintain high service levels without having excessive amounts of operating capital tied up in inventory that we don't need. All right, Well, that is the extent of the demo that we wanted to run through today. There's lots more that we could get into if anyone so desires. And if you are interested in learning more, I'm going to throw my email address up here. Feel free to fill out a form on our website, or you can reach out to me directly at vhart@demanddriventech.com. And if you are interested in these concepts but aren't quite sure how to determine if it's a good fit for your business, that's something that we can help with as well. We've got the ability to run simulations as a free service where we can gather some of your demand history and build a model to show, given the actual demand that you experience over a 12-month period, how would these buffers respond? What kind of service levels and inventory levels would we see, both at the item level as well as at the aggregate level? That can give you a really good idea of A, how well DDMRP can fit into your organization, and then B, what kind of value, what kind of return on investment you might get from implementing these concepts. All right. So thanks so much for your attention in the presentation. Now I'd like to address any questions that are out there, and Brad Mitchler from DD Tech has been monitoring those. So Brad, do we have any questions?
We do, Victor. So a lot of good questions coming in here late in the webinar. So I'll kind of just go through them, and you can address these as they come up here.
Great.
The first question is, where is the lead time captured? And I'll just kind of answer this one very quickly. Replenishment Plus is not the system of record for data like lead time. We take lead time from the ERP system, so we're not doing any sort of vendor performance measurement to calculate lead time, but we simply take it as an input from the ERP system that we're integrated with. We very much like to have static and conservative lead times in order to drive stable buffers, and we ask that clients update their lead times on more of an S&OP basis via the ERP system. So that's how we manage lead time. There is a question around how do we bring in new parts without historical demand? Great question on this, and we actually have a brand new, I think, quite robust feature around what we call part transition, which would include this and some other use cases for phase in and phase outs of parts that would allow you to link items, new items, to different items in the environment in order to bring them up to speed while they build demand history, such that they can have a buffer from the get-go. We also have the ability to leverage a forecast that we input into the system to drive the sizing of the buffer for new parts before we have demand history as well. So a couple different features and use cases depending on the data that's available and the type of new part introduction that we have there, but certainly a use case that we have to address and with all of our clients that use DDMRP. There's a question about how do we manage low runners in the application. So certainly, you know, when we talk about strategic inventory positioning, we're not putting a buffer or, you know, using this dynamic DDMRP concept on every single part of the environment. It's critical that we have the ability to manage low runners via different mechanisms in Replenishment Plus. So we have a few different options there. A lot of our clients, as we go down the tail of high runners to more medium and low runners, will switch to using a static min-max approach for managing the replenishment of some of those mid runners. And finally, of course, for the very low runners, we will have what's called non-buffered parts, which are buy to order, make to order, and distribute to order as well. We can manage all of these inside of our Plus, which allows clients to generally use Replenishment Plus to manage their entire part portfolio. All right, a couple more questions here. What if, how can we manage an item purchased from double sourcing? So today in Replenishment Plus, we have to identify a preferred and default vendor for each purchase item, even if it's double sourced, such that we can build a stable buffer profile or buffer zone based on that information. Typically today, a client would manage the dual sourcing of an item on the ERP side after the pass-back interface occurs with Replenishment Plus to the ERP system. But certainly, you know, dual sourcing of items and choosing vendors on the workbench purchasing execution screen is on the roadmap for 2021. So that's something that we would address in the software here coming up. There are a couple questions around the recording. So the recording will definitely be available and sent via email after the webinar. So absolutely, and thanks for the great feedback there. There's a question around supplier promise dates. So especially as it relates to alerts, it's very important that we get a confirmed promise date back from the vendor or from manufacturing as well, as it relates to our request date from orders that we're approving. So if we approve an order for a date and the vendor sends back a confirmation for date for a week later, we will drive the alerts and the all activity view that you saw based on the updated date. So absolutely, we take that into account when we interface Replenishment Plus. Let's see, how many references can one person manage in the system? You know, really it depends on the environment, the client environment, right? We have clients that have hundreds of thousands of, you know, SKUs and location combinations in the system, and depending on the complexity and the automation that the client chooses to enact within Replenishment Plus, they could manage hundreds and obviously thousands as well. Can the system be used for distribution? Definitely. You know, hopefully everybody saw the Demand Institute webinar distribution series that just came out over the last couple of weeks. Some great content there, but we have a lot of clients that are leveraging Replenishment Plus for distribution as either mainly distribution strategy or distribution as a part of a larger vertical supply network. So absolutely, DDMRP in general is a great fit for distribution in many cases, and certainly we have a lot of proof points in this industry. There's a couple more questions here, but since we're out of time and we're a couple minutes over, I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar, and we will follow up with some of these more detailed questions about specific industries and the like via email.
All right, okay. Great. Thank you, Brad. Thanks so much for everyone. Really appreciate your time today. Hope this was really educational, really useful hour of your time, and you got some value out of it. So as Brad said, those questions that we didn't get time to get to on the webinar today, we'll be reaching out to via email. And then if anybody has any additional questions, would like to dive into any of these concepts in any more detail, please don't hesitate to reach out to us either via the contact us form on our website or directly via my email that you see in front of you. And we'd be happy to help you explore your demand-driven journey. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day, and we hope to speak with some of you soon.